yours. All of this is the imagination of the prosecution, or, should I say, they want you to imagine it. Good night, nurse. To say he is going to kill his wife to keep from getting a divorce because if he got divorced he might lose business, that is going so far. It's an incredible stretch. They would have you believe that he went home for dinner and took this pipe and bludgeoned his wife to death and stabbed her 8 times after that because he was having stress in his business, Minton argued. He pointed out that the top executives at the company had testified that Roger was doing fine at work. The defense attorney argued that there would have been no financial gain to Roger as a result of the murder. Minton said the matter of Roger's demeanor after the murder was only the manifestation of a corporate executive handling a crisis the way he had been trained to handle it, with calm and reflection. They want to punish him for being a man about his problems, said Minton. He has conducted himself like a man, and they can't stand it. He argued that on the day of the murder, Roger was doing what he had done dozens of times before. He was completely absorbed in preparing for a very important meeting of the corporate board of directors. He was intently focused on a major presentation. Does he have on his mind some fat-bottomed young thing that at times he goes out to a motel with or wherever? Asked Minton, incredulous. No, he does not. He is getting ready for the board meeting. Is this a marriage falling apart? Is this a man who is sitting around planning to murder his wife? Minton went over the timeline with the jurors, pointing out that Roger had been consistent in every statement he ever made about what he did that evening. He said the schedule Roger described to police made sense. It was clear that Detective Carter had urged Roger to try to tell what he thought had happened that night. What do you speculate? This is what the detective asked him to do. Every single thing that Roger has said from the very beginning pans out. He paused for a few seconds. Except for the bag that was found in the dumpster, Minton continued, taking the plastic garbage bag from the evidence table and holding it up. In it were 5 gloves. 4 of them have fingerprints in them. Those are his prints. Those are his gloves. There is no question in the world about that. Those gloves were in this bag out in that garbage. The bag was found with leaves and garbage in it, too. There were not 2 gloves, there were 5 gloves, and they wound up in this bag. I don't know when they got in that bag, Minton said, and I can't tell you who the killer was. All I can tell you is that finding these gloves in his garbage was not a surprise to us. We have presented testimony that Roger wears these gloves when he does anything. But if you wear these gloves in a vicious attack and twist and bang a pipe, you would not have the kind of prints that were found in these gloves. He reminded the jury of the expert witness who had testified that after the violent motion necessary to carry out the attack, any prints in the gloves would have been smeared and unreadable. So discarded gloves wind up in this dumpster behind his office, Minton continued, in an effort to minimize the importance of that evidence. Roger's gloves were found in a garbage bag from Roger's house with other trash from the house. I don't know how the bag got in the dumpster behind his office. The killer must have been in a panic, grabbed the bag with the gloves and other trash from the garage, and thrown the jewelry, the pipe, and knife into the bag. It's all bouncing around in there together. It is no surprise that the gloves would have blood on them from the blood on these other items coming in contact with them. I will never know how the police got onto the bag in the dumpster either, Minton said sarcastically. It is the first time I have seen police confiscate a dumpster. I do not believe the young officer is lying under oath about it being a hunch and not a tip, but by golly, it is strange. I have never seen anyone take a crime scene truck with all those people and a photographer to search a dumpster on a policeman's hunch. He described, with a tone of disbelief, how they had documented every phase of the dumpster dive and contents with numerous photographs. I thought this was crazy. Somebody had to be tipping these people, the police, off. But we are stuck with that story, he said. What we are not stuck with is this. Roger did not have murder on his mind. Are you seriously going to believe that in the middle of everything he was doing that day, that he is going to come home for supper when his wife calls and brutally beat his wife of 35 years to death? Minton pointed out the conflicting testimony of the state's two medical examiners, Dr. Roberto Bayardo of Travis County and Dr. Vincent DeMaio from Bexar County. Minton gave a somewhat creative interpretation of what the two forensic pathologists said on the stand. Bayardo testified that any one of the 6 blows would have killed her. Every one of those 6 blows fractured her skull, said Minton. Bayardo said the other bruises, the lawyer held up his hands to the jury, were defense bruises. Then they, the prosecution, go, just like they did with the DNA, and get another guy to come up here and take the witness stand without ever having talked to Dr. Bayardo, without having looked at the autopsy. And he tells you, oh no, there weren't but 3 of those blows that caused a fracture. Why is it that the state puts on their own witness and then decides they better call in somebody else to clean all that stuff up? Because they wanted somebody to say that she was attacked from the back. I doubt it. I think Penny turned around before anyone got to her, and I think there was some struggle. I think that DNA is there on her hands, and it belongs to somebody else, and by God, it does not belong to that man right there. He pointed to Roger. Then they hire a high-dollar corporation to send a chemist down here to say that's contaminated, and then get on a plane and go home. I have thought about it from every viewpoint, Minton concluded. You have thought about it, too. Did Vanessa do it? Did Sarah do it? No, no, no. That stuff is crazy. I do not know who did it. But this evidence does not show that Roger did it. Roger Skaggs is not guilty of murdering Penny. The defense rested its case. Assistant District Attorney Buddy Meyer took the prosecution's rebuttal argument to the jury. There is nothing on the door of this courtroom that says you must leave your common sense out of the deliberation as you try to reach a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. The opinions of the defense lawyers are not evidence, said Meyer. The evidence is what was presented as exhibits in this case and testimony under oath from the witness stand. But when weighing this evidence, you are allowed to use your own common sense. He went over the key evidence presented by the prosecution during the trial and then addressed the challenges the defense had raised about some of the state's evidence and testimony. It is not unusual that unidentifiable fingerprints will be found at a murder scene in a residence, Meyer explained. Unidentifiable fingerprints at a scene does not mean that the perpetrator left prints behind. The previous week, Penny had conducted a class of about 20 people in the room where the murder occurred. The Skaggses had a maid who came in once a week to do the vacuuming and dusting. Since she was usually there Thursday mornings, she had not cleaned that room since the last meeting. Some of the unidentified prints probably belonged to those who attended that class. We have a responsibility to investigate to the fullest possible extent, to present you the experts and their evidence, he said. But the police may not be able to answer every question or to identify every fingerprint or fiber left at a scene. Meyer then addressed the time of death. He said Detective Thompson, who was at the autopsy, had testified that the contents of Penny's stomach looked like the food in the pot on the kitchen counter when the police arrived that night. Digestion had barely started when she died. The prosecutor referred to the testimony of the two medical examiners who had both used food digestion and liver temperature to estimate time of death. I'm not going to tell you it's an exact science, said Meyer, because you heard them say it is not. The widest range of time that this murder could possibly have taken place was between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. The shortest time frame I heard was between 5 and 6 o'clock. You have witnesses that he, Roger, left the office at around 5:30, and you have his statement that he ate supper and went back to his office around 7 or 7:15 p.m. In the defendant's statement, he puts himself in the house during a fraction of the time the experts said this murder occurred. In the narrowest time frame, he is at home. Responding to Minton's notion that someone else put the murder weapons on top of the garbage at Roger's house, the prosecutor said the garbage had been taken out to the street and picked up the afternoon of the murder. All the trash would have been taken away. There would have been no garbage in the trash bag in the garage, said Meyer. He said there was no other trash from the house in the bag containing the weapons, gloves, and jewelry, and that any leaves there must have come from the dumpster. Everything in that bag was put in that bag after the defendant killed Penny, he said. Meyer arranged the damning gloves on the railing in front of the jury box. The defendant's fingerprints were found in 4 of these 5 gloves, Meyer said. Both fingerprint experts, the defense witness and the witness for the prosecution, said there is no doubt they are the prints of the defendant. It's probable there were latex gloves in a box in the garage that night. You've seen the photographs. The prosecutor reminded the jury that on at least one of the gloves, glove number 1, Penny's blood was found on both the inside and outside. There were blood stains found inside these gloves. There is no way that the blood from the victim could have gotten inside the gloves, except for the defendant to have gotten blood on his hands and then put the gloves on. There is no way the blood could have been transferred to the gloves after the other items were tossed in the bag and rattled around. Meyer said he wasn't going to talk about the DNA except to say one thing. It is real simple. They want the DNA to be a mixture. It is not a mixture. It is contamination, and has nothing to do with who killed Penny Skaggs. He said that in the spring of 1995, Roger decided he was going to have an affair with a 28-year-old employee from his company. That relationship went on up until Penny's death, and even after Penny's death. The defense wants you to believe we are involved in a character assassination to get a conviction. We do not make up the evidence in the case. We bring you the evidence. It is your prerogative to decide what the facts are, and if you do not think it's important, that is your decision. The evidence is clear that Penny was sitting at the piano when she was attacked, and there is no way that she was able to resist the attack by Roger Skaggs, Meyer said. I say Roger Skaggs because he puts himself at the scene in his own statement. After they got through dinner, she put the dishes on the kitchen counter. She thought Roger had gone back to work. Meyer picked up the pipe and approached the jury box. Penny went to the piano to play. He wanted Penny to think he had gone back to work, and he did. But the evidence shows that first, he went into the garage and got a pipe and went back into the house. He viciously beat her to death with this pipe. In the process of that vicious attack, the music was knocked from the piano. An earring and her glasses were thrown across the room. The state's lawyer laid the pipe down and picked up the carving knife. After he was finished hitting her with the pipe, he took this knife and began to cut and stab her because he had to make it look like the murder was committed by an angry, vicious person that would not be within his character. When he got through stabbing her, he staged the crime scene for whatever reason. You saw that he put the music back, but did not realize it was upside down. At some time in setting up the crime scene, he unlocked the back door. He went into the master bathroom and took the drawers and contents of the jewelry box and threw it into the bathtub to make it look like a burglary. He also went into the kitchen and cleaned off the pipe and knife and took the jewelry off Penny, the ring, the necklace, and the bracelet, leaving one of the necklaces. At some point, he put on and took off gloves. He then placed all this evidence in the bag. He left the house with only a very short time frame within which to dispose of the evidence. He had to be able to show he had been at the office at a specific time. He knew the routine in terms of the trash pickup. Because he was short on time and knew the routine, and because the dumpsters were a safe place, he threw the bag into the dumpster. It makes sense. The time frame, the comfort zone, and knowing the dumpsters would be picked up. Meyer said. If the trash pickup had been on time and the dumpsters hauled away before Detective Carter called to have them secured, we would not be here today. But thank gosh the trains weren't running on time. Based on the detective's training and experience, after talking to Roger Skaggs and having his suspicions raised, he had the dumpsters secured. Why would somebody who had been married to someone for 35 years, shortly after she had been murdered, say to a number of different people, "You know, I am going to remarry"? Why would Roger say something about remarrying to her sister when she came down here for the memorial service? Why, at the burial of his wife, would he wear a loud jacket with an eagle on the back of it? Because he had now been freed, and he could carry on his affair without paying any penalty. This is not a character assassination. This is a crime of greed and lies, and there was no other way to end the marriage, Meyer said. The prosecutor reminded the jury that the first emergency crews on the scene had not observed any blood on Roger's clothing. All the bleeding was around Penny's head and on the carpet and on her clothing. A man who has been married to a woman for 35 years tells the detective, "Penny and I have a wonderful marriage," goes into the house and finds his wife lying in a pool of blood. What would someone do? They would go to their knees and pick the person up to see what was the matter. Meyer dropped to his knees on the floor in front of the jury and went through the motions of tenderly wrapping his arms around a body. In doing that, they would have blood on them. Roger didn't do that because he knew, because he did it. The defendant has some of the best lawyers in the country, the best jury, and a very competent judge, said Meyer. I want you to be Penny's jury. I don't want you to leave this courthouse and ever think you arrived at the wrong verdict. The correct verdict in this case is that Roger Skaggs is guilty of murdering Penny Skaggs, not because I say it, but because the evidence proves it. At the end, Meyer stood before the jury holding a large portrait of Penny Skaggs in a vibrant red dress, smiling, her chin propped on one hand. I want you to remember Penny the way God made her, he said, and not what the defendant did to her. The judge ordered the jury to begin deliberations at 2:30 p.m. They had a late lunch sent in. The first vote they took was 8 for guilty and 4 for not guilty. They asked for a tape player so they could hear Roger's 911 call the night of the murder. The prosecutor had entered the tape into evidence but had not played it. The jurors deliberated until 9:30 p.m. before asking the court to allow them to retire for the evening without reaching a verdict. A half-dozen newspaper people were still sitting in the courtroom, talking. As they walked out, one reporter turned to another and said, I hope Roger's not superstitious. Today is Friday the 13th. Chapter 26. After a night locked up in a downtown hotel under the watchful eye of court bailiffs, the jurors returned to the courtroom at 8:50 Saturday morning to resume deliberations. A short time later, they sent a note to the court asking for additional information on 3 pieces of evidence. The jurors wanted to review testimony by Detective J.W. Thompson about the clothing found in the laundry, Detective Carter's testimony about the time the dumpsters had been picked up by the trash removal company, and testimony about latex glove number 5, rendered by fingerprint expert Glenn Unash. At 10:50 a.m., the jury sent Judge Wisser a second note, announcing they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was empty except for a gaggle of reporters. All the parties to the case had returned to their offices in anticipation of a long wait. Since the jury had deliberated 7 hours on the previous day, no one expected a verdict so quickly. Gradually, the representatives for the defense and prosecution drifted back and took their seats in the courtroom. Roger and Sarah walked in together. They were sitting at the defense table chatting when Penny's 3 sisters arrived and took their usual seats at the front of the visitor section. Tensions were high. The parties barely spoke as they waited. At last, Judge Wisser entered, took his seat on the high bench, and told the bailiff to bring in the jury. A row behind the sisters was filled with spectators who had earlier been identified as friends of Penny Skaggs. Some of these women sat holding hands. 2 were crying softly. Across the aisle, a small gathering of members of the First Evangelical Free Church sat silently. Several of them were obviously in deep prayer, with their heads bowed, their lips slightly moving. Judge Wisser whispered to the bailiff that he wanted extra deputies sent down to the courtroom from the sheriff's department offices upstairs. When the jurors were seated, the judge asked simply, "Does the jury have a verdict?" The foreman rose and without hesitation read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Roger Thomas Skaggs, guilty of the offense of murder as alleged in the indictment." Roger Skaggs looked momentarily stunned. Then the taciturn expression he had worn during most of the trial turned to a grimace as he squeezed his eyes and lips tightly together. Judge Wisser quickly thanked the jury and dismissed the members until 10 a.m. Monday, at which time the jury would hear testimony for the sentencing phase of the trial. As the jurors filed out, Sarah Skaggs came forward from her seat in the audience and went to her father's side at the defense table. She knelt and embraced him. Roger Skaggs began crying silently. He clenched and unclenched his fists in his lap. The lawyers on the defense side looked bewildered by the verdict. The 2 prosecutors showed no sign of emotion. The sisters, still in their seats, immediately pulled out their cell phones to call others in the family. As 4 burly deputies approached Roger, he handed his wallet to his daughter and rose to his feet. A deputy placed his arms behind him and snapped handcuffs on his wrists. With Roger in tow, the officers began making their way through the crowd that had gathered in the courtroom. In the hallway, television camera lights flooded the scene. The officers led Roger down the long corridor to a secured area used to move prisoners through the building. Reporters shouted questions at Roger. His only response to any of them was, "They got the wrong man." Out in the street, he was led across the plaza, where more TV cameras whirred as he passed, manacled between deputies, to an awaiting paddy wagon for transport to the main county jail. With the verdict in, he was not permitted to remain free before sentencing. He would spend the weekend in the same jail where he had been held after his arrest more than 2 years earlier. The defense of Roger Skaggs had been passionate and professional. It was adequately, if not liberally, funded, with Roger paying approximately $300,000 in legal fees and expenses to the defense team for the effort. The fee was believed to be far less than the going rate for the attorneys who comprised his defense team, especially for legal services of this complexity and duration. The defense had posited a plausible theory that someone else had murdered Penny Skaggs and framed Roger by planting evidence, including the gloves he routinely wore to clean his private plane, in the dumpster behind his office. But the defense case, put on by an expert legal team headed by the renowned Roy Minton, was brought low in the final deliberations by a tiny piece of evidence, traces of fingerprints in blood-splattered 15-cent latex gloves. In expressing his disappointment over the verdict, Minton told Court TV's Clara Tuma, "The physical evidence was compelling. It was my responsibility to get around it, and I didn't get around it." Although the defendant had been found guilty by a jury, the defense had not lost everything. Roger had enjoyed nearly 3 years of freedom during the long series of delays between the murder and the trial. And the death penalty, which Texas is so notorious for imposing, had been kept off the table from the beginning. He was going to prison, but would it be for the rest of his life, or with the hope of spending some of his remaining golden years on parole? Judge Wisser resumed the Skaggs trial at 10 a.m. Monday, November 16th, for the sentencing phase. In Texas, a convicted defendant can opt to have the sentence set by either the jury or the trial judge. Roger had requested that the jury decide his fate. Penny's sisters, who had attended every minute of the 3-week trial, came together once again for the sentencing phase. As they had throughout the trial, each woman wore a lapel pin made from a shiny 1996 penny to signify the year she was killed. In the Skaggs case, the sentencing phase of the trial was extremely important. The jury had wide leeway in the length of prison term it could assess for murder. There was a great deal at stake for Roger in the jury's decision. With a sentence of less than 15 years, the judge would have discretion to grant an appeal bond, under which Roger could remain free during the lengthy appeals process. A sentence of 15 years or more required him to begin serving prison time while his appeals were heard. The prosecution and defense put on only 2 witnesses each in this phase of the trial. Marilyn Mukey, one of the twin sisters, was the first witness for the prosecution. She said that for the past 2.5 years, she had assumed Penny's role as the primary caregiver of the aging parents, both of whom were in nursing homes in the Dallas area at the time of the trial. Prior to her death, Penny, who was the eldest of the 4 daughters, had the primary role of taking care of the parents, since she did not work and the other sisters had jobs. "Nothing like this has ever happened in our family," Marilyn said from the stand. "After March of 1996, my parents never recovered. They had some health problems, but were able to do so much for themselves. They have never come back. They were doubled over in pain, and they have never been able to stand up again. The loss of their daughter and the hurt that it has caused by their son-in-law has crushed them." Choking back tears, she said, "My dad has pain and anger in his eyes. Mother's spirit has been crushed." Mrs. Mukey said that the murder had destroyed her own family's happiness and tranquility forever. "There is a wide, black, dark line across our lives now. Our lives are divided by that line into before Penny and after Penny. I have to go over and over and over again, explaining to my children why this happened. I am a person of faith, and my faith has been shaken to the ground. If this could happen to Penny, it could happen to me. This is not an intrusion from the outside. It is something from within the family. My faith and trust in everything has been shattered." The sister said it had also been humiliating because people she meets now question what is wrong with a family in which a husband kills his wife. She said all the years of the family tradition of gathering for Christmas had been destroyed. Next, the eldest sister, Sharon Fox, took the stand for the second time in the trial. She testified that she had been plagued by nightmares since the murder. The nightmares were that she, too, would be killed and unable to take care of her sisters or parents. Mrs. Fox also said her faith had also been shaken. Shortly after the murder, she had sought assistance from grief counseling services. The defense asked the state to stipulate that Roger Skaggs had never been convicted of any crime other than a traffic violation anywhere in the world. The prosecution agreed to the request. Ken Schifrin, Roger's former boss, took the stand as the first defense witness. He talked about how well Roger handled pressure on the job during the 14 years they had worked closely together. "I have known Roger during some tough periods for the company, in good times and bad times," the chief executive officer of APS Group testified. "I have never heard him say a negative thing, even when there was a lot of stress. Roger always cared about his employees and did all he could for them. He loved Penny and Sarah and talked about them often." I know the jury has made its decision, and I still can't imagine that. But when he returns to society, I know he will make a good citizen. I know he will have a tough time finding a job, but when he does, he will do it well. On cross-examination, ADA Case said, "Is it clear that you, sitting there right now, do not believe that Roger Skaggs is guilty of this offense?" "Yes, it is," Schifrin replied. Case asked the executive if he was aware that Skaggs had continued the affair with Vanessa after Penny's murder, to which he replied, "I've become aware of it recently." "Do you have any comprehension of the hurt and pain that this defendant has caused so many members of this community?" Case asked. The hurt and pain has been awful for a lot of people. I understand that, Schifrin said. Are you aware that the murder of Penny Skaggs has caused hundreds of people in the evangelical church community to have their faith in humanity and in their God called into doubt? Case pressed. Yes, Penny Skaggs was a wonderful person. I don't question that, the executive said. Then the prosecutor posed a question to the defense witness that summed up the purpose of why they were there. Shouldn't a person who killed Penny be put in the penitentiary for a long, long time? Yes, Schifrin said grimly. When he left the stand, he went over to Roger and hugged him before walking out of the room. The only other defense witness in the sentencing phase was Roger and Penny's daughter, Sarah. Many people had wanted to hear from her, but she had not testified during the guilt phase of the trial. On the way up to the stand, she paused to embrace her father. Speaking in a small, quiet voice, she told the jury that she was now enrolled as a student at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas, with a 4.0 grade average. She was also employed as a part-time healthcare worker at a psychiatric clinic in Dripping Springs, Texas. Under questioning by Minton, she admitted to having gone through some rocky times with her mother during her teen years. It was rough, she said, but Minton put that in perspective. You know, without any doubt, that your mother was a wonderful gal, do you not? The attorney asked. She was, said Sarah. And you loved her deeply? Asked Minton. Very deeply, she said. Has your relationship with your daddy been good? The lawyer asked. Always. Sarah said her father had always been loving, supportive, and caring. He's the most wonderful man I know. My father was always very patient with me, even when I didn't give him a lot of cause to be patient. He was very loving, she said. Minton asked Sarah how she found out about her mother's death. She described how her father told her. He came over to my house, and I opened the door, and he said, "She's dead." And he broke down and he cried, much as he's doing now. She looked over at her father. Roger, who had been mostly stoic and unemotional throughout, had begun crying when his daughter described her feelings for him. Someone had handed him a large wad of tissues, and he mopped his eyes, one and then the other, repeatedly. On the night of the murder, Sarah said her father was very grief-stricken. She said before that night, she had only seen him cry once at his father's funeral. Since my mother's death, I have seen him cry several times. Roger's eyes, now red and swollen, continued to fill with tears. He dabbed at his eyes and blew his nose. Sarah explained that the testimony the jury had heard about Roger appearing cavalier at the graveside was false. She said that everyone in the family had agreed to wear casual clothing, and that the bright leather jacket was not as outrageous a display as had been described. My mother loved that jacket, she said. Then Minton led Sarah through a series of questions, obviously designed to bring home the fact that she had lost a beloved mother to murder and was now in danger of losing her father to incarceration. Has your mother's death been a terrible loss to you? He asked. More than anyone will ever know, she said. And the loss of your daddy, to whatever extent that is, will you tell us what that is going to be? It will be very hard, Sarah said haltingly. When she paused, Minton asked, Are you going to be all right? I'll be fine, she said. The state had no questions, and Sarah left the stand. She again embraced her father on the way out of the courtroom. The prosecution began summation for the sentencing phase, with Brian Case once more taking the argument to the jury. The veteran prosecutor told the jury that Roger Skaggs's crime had hurt literally hundreds of people in the community and across the state. He said that what Roger did was worse than the petty crimes of a career criminal. Andy said the lack of any evidence of his remorse was obvious in the way he acted after the murder. He slapped the face of those women, he said, dramatically pointing to the sisters seated on the front row, members of his and Penny's church and fellow employees. He asked the jury to send Roger Skaggs away for a long, long time as deterrence. Probation was completely inappropriate in a case like this one. What are we, as a community, going to tolerate? Case asked. Answering his own question, he said, we cannot tolerate this, especially from a person in a position of leadership and trust. The state asks for a lengthy, severe prison sentence, and I submit that is exactly what the evidence supports. When Charles Burton rose for the defense, he reminded the jury that the defense witnesses testifying here were friends of both Roger and Penny, not just Roger. They simply did not believe that Roger Skaggs was the kind of man capable of committing such an act. There are 12 of you here that can consider the wonderful lady Penny was, but also the kind of person Roger has been all his life. Do not return a verdict for the community or the press, but a sentence from your own conscience. This is a man who led an exemplary life for 56 years, Burton said. You may feel that something snapped or broke, but consider the kind of person he is now, because at 59 years of age, any sentence you give will affect the rest of his life. Buddy Meyer argued for the prosecution that anything less than a life sentence for a crime so brutal would be a travesty. His age has absolutely nothing to do with your decision. This is a court of justice, not a court of mercy. There is absolutely no mitigation in this case. Can you conceive of any murder case that is worse than what you have heard here in the last 3 weeks? He very brutally murdered her, and for absolutely no reason at all, knowingly and intentionally. Anything less than a life sentence is a victory for Roger Skaggs. He has taken everything from this community, from his own family. At exactly noon, the jury retired to deliberate. In 1998, under Texas sentencing guidelines for a murder conviction, the jury has 2 main options: life in prison or a term of years of no less than 5 and no more than 99. In addition, the jury could add a maximum fine of $10,000 to the sentence. At the time, there was no provision for life without the possibility of parole. Offenders who commit a crime of aggravated violence, such as murder, must serve half their sentences in actual time before becoming eligible for parole. If the sentence is 60 years or more, they must serve a minimum of 30 years before parole eligibility. Parole eligibility is determined by the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Good conduct time is granted at the discretion of the prison warden. Good conduct time is necessary to be considered for parole, but cannot shorten the minimum required sentence. The jury was out for only 2.5 hours before notifying the judge it had agreed upon a sentence. The courtroom was packed again when the jurors returned from their deliberations. Behind the last row of seats stood a phalanx of police officers, with a half-dozen deputies in uniform and as many plainclothes detectives. Judge Wisser asked the foreman to announce the sentencing verdict. The foreman read, "We, the jury, having found the defendant guilty of the offense of murder, assess his punishment at confinement in the Institutional Division at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for a term of 32 years and a fine of $10,000. The judge imposed the sentence and thanked the jury for its service. Roger was 59 years old at the time of the verdict. He would have to serve at least half of the 32-year sentence, which meant he would be 75 years old before he was eligible for parole. An appeal was certain in the case. The sisters expressed disappointment that Roger had not been given a life sentence. Resigned, Carolyn said, "We can at least sleep in peace for the next 16 years. For Twin Marilyn, There was a finality to it. Penny would never have divorced Roger, but our family wants a divorce from him. We do not want to ever see or talk to Roger Skaggs again. Chapter 27. A man who had his every whim catered to by a self-styled subservient wife for almost all his adult life must have found his first prison job as kitchen helper in a sprawling transit and evaluation unit particularly hellish. Roger's relative wealth, which had bought him more than 2 years of freedom before his trial, could do little for him where he was headed after his conviction and sentencing for murder. Roger went straight into the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System at the Holiday Transfer Facility on the outskirts of Huntsville, Texas. He spent his first 6 months of incarceration at the center, where newly arriving male convicts are diagnosed for physical health and mental condition and evaluated for suitable placement in a permanent prison. Texas operates 96 prison units of various types throughout the state. In recent years, much has been written about the Texas penal system being run by the inmates and out of the control of the guards and wardens. While the state's prisons are certainly not the worst in America, the Texas system is overcrowded and understaffed. Texas prison guards, among the lowest paid in the country, are also the lowest paid officers in the state's criminal justice system, earning far less than the average metropolitan police officer, sheriff's deputy, or highway patrolman. Unsatisfactory compensation results in tremendous turnover of personnel at all the prison units and little time to train the replacements. Texas prison funding is considered scandalous and a low priority for the conservative politicians who assumed almost total control of state government in the early 1990s. Starvation budgets for the rapidly growing prison population resulting from stricter sentencing laws has created what was described as a fatal environment by Nate Blakesley in the Austin Chronicle. The investigative reporter who examined the alarming increase in assaults by inmates on prison personnel found that security in the state system began to deteriorate rapidly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. More than 2,000 Texas prison guards were assaulted by inmates in 1999, Roger Skaggs' first year in prison, compared with only 133 such assaults in 1988. Inmate-on-inmate assaults were also higher during this period. Those who argue that the inmates are running the institution may have a good case to make. The Texas inmate population explosion began in the 1990s, when the public became angered by the revolving door in the state's prisons. The state tried to maintain manageable prison population by discharging inmates, regardless of their suitability for parole, at approximately the same rate that Texas courts were sending new convicts into the system. When the public demanded that convicts serve longer portions of their sentences, the legislature had to quickly expand capacity and went on a prison-building frenzy. But the lawmakers, either cynically or negligently, did not provide enough new funding to improve management and operations of the system itself. In 1999, as Roger was adjusting to prison life, Texas temporarily attained the dubious distinction of housing the largest number of convicts of any system in the United States. That year, the prison population soared to 163,190. Texas has since dropped to second place behind California, but its prison population remains consistently high, hovering around 165,000 inmates. The entire federal prison population is only slightly larger than that of the Texas state system. It has been said that prisons have become the universities for violent gangs. The number of prison gangs affiliated with notorious criminal organizations outside the walls has increased in Texas, as in other systems across the country. In this regard, Roger's advancing age may work to his advantage. The old-timers are of little value or interest to the prison gangs, either inside or outside prison, and if they stay clear of the gangs and mind their own business, they are usually ignored. For the first time in his life, Roger Skaggs' day-to-day existence was completely out of his control, as he faced the harsh reality of a long-term sentence in this system. Just as he had clung to the belief that a jury would find him innocent of the murder of his wife, he now held on to hope that his sentence would be overturned on appeal. The initial effort to get a new trial was directed at the district court where he had been convicted. Ironically, his former girlfriend, who had become the object of a nationwide search when a material witness warrant was issued after her disappearance, was once again in the newspaper headlines. The young woman had returned to Austin, providing no public explanation for where she had been before or during the trial. Defense attorney Randy Levitt filed a motion with Judge John Wisser for a new trial based on the reappearance of Rogers' principal alibi witness. Levitt maintained that her testimony would have had a material impact on the outcome of the trial and that a new trial was merited, since this witness was now available. Vanessa Ferguson was represented by one of Austin's most successful criminal lawyers, Joseph A. Joe Turner. He provided the defense lawyers with an affidavit signed by Ferguson that supported Rogers' alibi about his whereabouts the night of the murder. The document also denied that the affair had been serious enough to be the motive for murder. In the affidavit, she verified that neither Roger nor the defense team had anything to do with her leaving town, although she did not shed any light on why or where she had gone. Levitt's motion for a new trial also made the unusual claim that one of the original jurors for the Skaggs trial was mentally incompetent to serve due to the effects of childhood encephalitis. Judge Wisser quickly turned down the motion for a new trial based on the defense effort to have the original verdict thrown out. While his personal assets had been substantially depleted by the trial, Roger still had the financial means to fund a vigorous appeal. At the end of the murder trial, lawyer Roy Minton had briefly mentioned his client's legal expenses and finances in an interview with Court TV's Clara Tuma. Minton said he believed Roger still had several $100,000, even after paying for his initial defense, which would be more than enough for the appeals process. Minton claimed that, although Penny's will had left everything to Roger, he had waived it and given the money to Sarah. After being turned down for a new trial at the local court level, Roger hired the law firm of Joe Turner, the same attorney representing Vanessa, to take his case to the state appeals courts. Turner, nicknamed Mad Dog when he was a prosecuting attorney because of his aggressive courtroom tactics, headed the largest practice in Austin devoted entirely to criminal law. Since opening his own practice in the late 80s, he had won numerous criminal cases at trial or on appeal. But even he acknowledged that in Texas's hard-nosed law and order environment, the state appellate process was skewed against the convicted. Turner had recently succeeded in getting a highly publicized marijuana possession charge dismissed against Texas music icon Willie Nelson, and successfully represented one of the Waco Branch Davidians against federal conspiracy and murder charges. Both those cases received national media coverage. While working on the Skaggs appeal, Turner represented another client in a case that drew national publicity. Actor Matthew McConaughey was arrested in October 1999 for playing bongo drums quite late into the night in his posh West Side neighborhood. Police charged that McConaughey was dancing naked and smoking marijuana when they answered complaints of neighbors, and that he resisted arrest. Turner succeeded in getting the charges reduced to a misdemeanor of disturbing the peace, and the actor paid a $50 fine. The colorful attorney, whose courtroom tactics included highly animated theatrics more frequently seen in TV crime dramas, was also a vintner. He operated his own winery and vineyards, located behind his home in the Texas Hill Country. Turner's entry into the case caused another flurry of press coverage. The flamboyant lawyer always made sure his client's cases got the maximum attention at every stage of the process. He believed that the bright lights of public exposure prevented the innocent and the little man from being either lost in the system or steamrolled by the powerful state judicial and law enforcement apparatus. The pendulum has swung so far to the right in our appellate courts that a convicted person can hardly get a reversal, even when he's innocent, Turner said. This case goes to the heart of the system. The appeal is not based on some technicality. Every citizen is entitled to an independent judgment. Here we had an unqualified juror, and a defendant is entitled to a full jury of 12 qualified peers. Here you have unidentified DNA in the house and on the victim. Here you have a new witness who can testify that the defendant was focused normally on his work, not behaving like a man who had just killed his wife of 35 years. This is how innocent people are sent to prison. Here you have reasonable doubt. A defense attorney in Turner's office with strong credentials as an appeals specialist was assigned the Skaggs file and began the process. The appeals lawyer was Terry W. Kirk, an honors graduate of the University of Texas Law School. He had amassed an impressive legal record for gaining dismissals and reversals of cases in both pretrial and post-trial proceedings before state and federal courts in Texas. If Joe Turner was reputed to be a mad dog for his aggressiveness in the courtroom, Terry Kirk could be characterized as a bulldog for the tenacity he brought to the cases he handled during the laborious appeals process. Roger Skaggs's case would be no exception. Like his colorful law partner, Kirk enjoyed an avocation beyond his law practice. He was a professional actor who had played the enigmatic policeman in the cult movie classic Slacker, and frequently pursued other acting roles in Austin's budding movie industry. When the appeals process began, it was estimated that Roger's appeals would cost an additional $50,000. However, before it was over, those estimates had grown to between $75,000 and $100,000. Kirk petitioned the Texas Court of Appeals to reverse the guilty verdict, claiming 6 points of error in the trial. The points for reversal argued in the appeal faulted the trial court for 1. Failure of the state court to hold a hearing on a motion for a new trial. 2. Denial of the defense motions for a new trial based on the mental disability of one of the jurors. 3. Denial of the defense motions to suppress evidence illegally seized from the Skaggs home. 4. Admission of evidence about the state's efforts to locate the missing witness. 5. Admission of hearsay evidence about Penny's feelings of hurt and upset that Roger had not taken care of her during a recent illness. 6. Permitting the state to withhold evidence that DNA in the case might have been contaminated. In answering the appeal, the district attorney's office secured sworn affidavits from jurors in the original trial, attesting to the full participation and competence of the juror the defense had claimed was unfit to serve because of mental disabilities. Following several appearances that concluded with final oral arguments in December 1999, the Texas Court of Appeals denied Roger Skaggs's pleadings on October 18, 2000. Kirk next prepared a new appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the highest criminal appellate level in the state court system. While that petition, based on the same grounds as the first appeal, was working its way through the lengthy process, Roger became involved in an unusual federal hearing of an entirely different kind, which had nothing to do with his efforts to gain release from prison. In November 2003, the Federal Communications Commission issued a show cause order to revoke his advanced class amateur radio operator license and a license he held to operate amateur radio station W5EBC in Austin. Mr. Skaggs's murder conviction raises very serious questions as to whether he possesses the requisite character qualifications to be and to remain a commission licensee, and whether his license should be revoked, the FCC said. Apparently, few people were aware that Roger Skaggs had a ham radio license or that he operated an amateur radio station. He certainly could not be permitted to operate a radio station from a prison cell, yet he had held the licenses since 1954, when he was 15 years old, and had most recently renewed them in 2000 while serving in prison. The licenses were revoked by the FCC at a hearing in Washington, D.C., on April 22, 2004. Far more serious for Roger was the late 2004 denial of his motion for a new trial by the highest criminal appeals court in Texas. His attorney was still determined to fight. Terry Kirk immediately began preparing to take the case to the federal appeals court based on a claim of ineffective counsel at the main trial. It was a tough sell, since Roger had been represented by one of the best criminal defense teams in Texas. But Kirk was determined to exhaust every legal avenue available to get him a new trial. The federal phase of the appeals process was finally placed before the United States District Court for the Western Division of Texas. The court was in Austin, where the entire legal process had begun almost 6 years before. Although a criminal appeals process is conducted outside the public limelight in relative obscurity, the Skaggs case was far from forgotten history in the Austin community, or the country for that matter. 3 nationally televised documentaries about the murder of Penny Skaggs were produced and aired well after the public trial was over. The first documentary was created for Court TV's Crime Story series by independent producer Richard Crowling. Crime Story is Court TV's cornerstone series in its expanded primetime programming. Entitled Death of an Angel, Texas vs. Skaggs, the 2-hour television special first aired in 1999, the year after the trial, and is rerun regularly. The documentary featured interviews with members of Penny's family, friends, and fellow church members, as well as attorneys, homicide detectives, and forensic specialists involved in the case. Following the premiere of that show, Court TV conducted a live internet chat on Yahoo with Clara Tuma, who had originally covered the trial for Court TV, and Katie Van Scoy, who had covered the trial for the Austin Chronicle. The national coverage of the Austin murder case gained momentum in 2002 when Dateline NBC, in a cooperative effort with Court TV, aired a primetime documentary introduced by anchor Stone Phillips and investigated and narrated by network reporter Sarah James. The documentary, entitled Dead Reckoning, went beyond a rehashing of the brutal murder to take the audience inside the Texas penal system where Roger Skaggs was imprisoned. Ms. James was able to secure an interview with a convicted husband, the only media exposure Roger had agreed to since his conviction. Choking back tears, he maintained his innocence while insisting to the network reporter that he was unjustly incarcerated. I still loved my wife. We still had sex. We still traveled together. We still loved each other, he told James. I was just too greedy and wanted more. I'm innocent. The third national TV documentary of the case, entitled The Perfect Wife, was produced by A&E for its primetime American Justice series. The hour-long program, narrated by Bill Curtis, revisited the case through interviews with the principals from law enforcement, the defense and prosecution teams, and family and friends of both the murder victim and her convicted husband. On December 9, 2005, after more than a year in the federal appellate process, Roger Skaggs' attorney, Terry Kirk, was notified by the U.S. District Court that the latest appeal had been denied. Kirk remained undaunted. He told his client he was prepared to take the case even higher up the federal appeals channels to the 5th U.S. Circuit of Appeals. However, 10 days later, Roger notified the lawyer that he did not intend to pursue it further. He had been in prison for more than 7 years and still had a minimum of 9 years to serve before he would be eligible for parole. Kirk said that, with the appeals process concluded, Roger's best hope for a shortened sentence was a special needs parole based on his advancing age. The lawyer acknowledged this leniency was very rarely offered in a tough, law-and-order state like Texas. As a convicted murderer, Roger Skaggs was permanently assigned to the Alfred T. Hughes Unit at Gatesville, Texas, a maximum security prison. Gatesville is 91 miles north of Austin on a rolling plain of short native grass called the Blackland Prairie. While Austin is characterized by its booming high-tech industry. Gatesville is known for its prison industry. The small town is home to 5 correctional institutions, including 2 women's prisons, 2 men's prisons, and the state's largest juvenile detention center. The Hughes unit, where Skaggs is incarcerated, has an average inmate population of 3,000 and is one of the more modern prison structures in the state, having been opened in 1990. But it looks like what it is, a prison. The Hughes unit is built just out of sight of the town on a treeless stretch of table-flat farmland, without even a shrub to break the austere background of white, multi-storied block buildings. Sometime in the past, the inmate laborers were apparently tasked with an attempt at aesthetic improvement by building a series of low rock walls on the outer perimeter of the grounds. But instead of beautifying the grounds, the rough-hewn structures somehow came off looking like a maze leading into the prison. Inmates, dressed in white baggy trousers and shirts, are restricted to a life almost entirely inside the prison walls and fences. Because it is a maximum security facility, the long-term inmates are not taken outside the perimeter of the prison to work in the money-making agricultural programs that are found at many of Texas's farm units. When he arrived at Gatesville, the former corporate executive's first regular job was in the prison's gigantic dining hall and kitchen. In his new life, the formerly pampered husband was now a kitchen helper, feeding 3,000 convicted hard-timers and cleaning up after them. Roger's sleeping accommodations were in even starker contrast to the comfort he had previously enjoyed. He was assigned a bunk, a sink, and a toilet in a large circular block of cells. The housing facilities for inmates of Texas prisons are not air-conditioned, though the summers often bring weeks of 3-digit temperatures with high humidity. The cells face a central guard station from which inmates in this huge section are under constant surveillance. Roger's day begins in the middle of the night. He is up at 3 a.m. for breakfast at 3:30 and works a 12-hour day from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. From then until bedtime at 9, inmates can read, write, or study. His many years as a computer expert ultimately won him a better job. He was assigned as an inventory control specialist in the prison's garment factory. There were no extra benefits attached, except that much of the new job was performed in an air-conditioned prison office. While other inmates swelter through the hellish Texas summer heat, both in their living quarters and on the job, Roger can escape during work hours to one of the only cool spots in the place. Prison life in Texas is Spartan. The state allots $38.01 per day to house, feed, clothe, and provide health care for Roger and each of his fellow inmates. Most of that is spent on salary for the guards. The state allots $2.21 a day for food and 14 cents a day for housing for each prisoner at the Hughes unit. Roger Skaggs's anguish over his new circumstances was apparent during the interview with Ms. James in the Dateline NBC documentary. He lamented that his 32-year sentence amounted to a life term for him, since he would be 75 before he was even eligible for parole. The Dateline documentary was made before the appeals were exhausted. Roger, choking back tears, told the journalist, "No male in my family has lived to 75. I'll die here if I don't get an appeal and a new trial." His father had passed away at the age of 71. Roger still has a small and gradually diminishing circle of stalwart friends who cling to the belief of his innocence despite the jury's decision. He gets an occasional visitor on a Saturday or Sunday when inmates are allowed one visitor for a 2-hour stay. His visitors are treated politely, but must go through 3 levels of security searches before being allowed into the restricted area. Then they can only talk with him by phone while looking through reinforced glass windows. No touching is allowed, not even a handshake or an embrace. His daughter Sarah still comes to see him, but her new career and family have taken her far from Texas, and the trips are now infrequent. Longtime friend Joe Edwards is one of the few who continued to visit Roger after he was transferred to Gatesville. Edwards, who lives at Georgetown, an hour's drive from the prison, has been greatly saddened by his contacts with his old friend from happier days in Killeen in the late 1960s. While he sees Roger less often now, he still corresponds with him and keeps him supplied with the latest books. Roger makes lists of the titles he wants to read and mails them to Edwards, who purchases the books and has them sent to Roger under the vendor's label. Inmates are not allowed to receive books or merchandise directly from individuals. Money must be deposited to a prisoner's account rather than given to the prisoner directly. For several years, Joe Edwards' wife, who recently passed away, helped Roger with one of his other new prison pastimes. She arranged to have sent to him, in bulk, copies of literature to hand out at a class he had started inside the walls. The literature was a small religious magazine called The Upper Room. Ironically, Roger conducts a Bible study course in prison. His flock is made up of the most hardened, convicted criminals, a far cry from the young women who eagerly followed Penny's biblical teachings on how to make a godly home. Epilogue. Penny's parents lived to see Roger imprisoned for the murder of their daughter. Her father died in May 2000 at the age of 85. Mittie Earl was 91 when she passed away 3 years later. 10 years after the murder of their beloved older sister, Sharon Fox, Carolyn Pittenger, and Marilyn Mukey still join in a telephone conference call at 10 p.m. on appointed days to hold a prayer circle. The sessions have helped them cope with this family tragedy and keep Penny's memory alive. As a direct result of the murder, the oldest sister, Sharon, studied and became a certified grief facilitator through the American Academy of Bereavement. She leads a grief counseling ministry through her church in a suburban community near Dallas. Roger and Penny's daughter, Sarah, and Penny's sisters have made every effort to put this sad event behind them and come together as a family. Sarah told a television interviewer that the family had agreed to disagree about Roger's role in Penny's murder. In 1999, a year after the trial, Sarah graduated summa cum laude from Texas State University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology and a minor in criminal justice. She received a Juris Doctor, JD degree from Temple University's James E. Beasley School of Law in 2004. Her aunts Sharon, Marilyn, and Carolyn attended her graduation. Sarah practices civil law as an associate with a major East Coast law firm and has done pro bono work through the Local Defenders Association. She is married to the man she was dating at the time of her mother's murder. Homicide Detective Sergeant David Carter, whose systematic investigation led to the first break in the murder case, was promoted through the ranks of the Austin Police Department and named Assistant Chief in March 2006. In October, Carter and other Austin officials went to Iraq to discuss methods for improving that country's emergency services through coordination of local police, fire, and medical response teams. As of this writing, Roger Skaggs had served 8 years in prison, just half the minimum years required before he could be considered for parole. In correspondence with the author, he has held fast to his assertion of innocence. The jury was split, but finally convicted me of a crime I did not commit and sentenced me to 32 years in prison, Roger said. I was tried and convicted primarily on the basis that my affair provided a motive for murder. Roger has pragmatically accepted that he faces many more years in prison and recently said he will put his time and place to the best use possible under the reality of the circumstances. I see it as a wonderful opportunity to teach and mentor fellow inmates who have not had the same opportunity, he said. I am now in a unique position to be a surrogate father and mentor to many men. People who are going to school to better themselves can learn academic facts and vocational skills, which are, of course, important. However, the things that determine success in life are strongly related to attitude, work ethic, and social, personal, financial, and organizational skills. These are the things I am trying to model and teach to those around me. Not only may it have a positive influence on others and give them coping skills for their release, but it also gives me a positive agenda. Under Texas sentencing laws, Roger will be eligible for parole in the year 2014. Penny's sisters plan to protest any early release. This concludes The Good Wife by Clint Richmond, narrated by Stephen Bowlby. Copyright 2007 by Clint Richmond. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Folio Literary Management and was produced in the year 2023 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit Tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.